If you're like me, you've probably been curious, possibly even fascinated by the practice of money laundering, how it works, how people do or do not get caught, and how it's used to fund crime, criminals, and even terrorism. Today, we'll be hearing from one of the world's best anti-money laundering experts. Paul Coleman is an alumnus of Barclays Bank, just like our fellow member Derek Arden. And he gave up the cold, the fog, and the damp weather of London and moved to the Caribbean to take over the Barclays Bank branches and operations there and in Central America. He soon fell in love with the lifestyle, and except for a brief period when he returned to London in the year 2000, he has lived there continuously ever since. During that time, he worked in 14 different countries with a melting pot of different laws, different cultures, and different languages, and had to navigate the vagaries of inter-island travel. More recently, he has held positions in the field of anti-money laundering in both the private and the public sectors. He is now semi-retired, but still living in the Turks and Caicos Island as a consultant. Please join me in giving a warm and enthusiastic Golden Gate Breakfast Club welcome to Paul Coleman.
$91 million. Let me say it again, $91 million. By the time I finish this presentation, according to the United Nations, that amount of money will have been laundered throughout the world, $91 million. Good morning, Golden Gate Breakfast Club members and guests. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. I want to talk to you about three things. I want to talk to you about what and the why of money laundering. I'll help you to learn about the global response to crime, which touched upon earlier today about being careful about so much of it. And then I would also like to just bring us back to a lot more personal, and because so many of you, as the morning goes on, will be saying, yes, that's all very interesting, but it's not in my backyard. I might be able to dispel that myth from you. So let's start with what and why is money laundering. What we would normally start off with is Al Capone, and everybody says he's the man who was first man to be caught by laundering money. He had his washaterias, he was a gangster, whatever. In the 1920s, there wasn't any criminal sanctions against money laundering. He was actually prosecuted for tax evasion. But it just sounds good that Al Capone was a warning. It wasn't until 1982 when the first person and it was in the US by coincidence, who was prosecuted and convicted for the laundering of money. That was a start. But about that time, 1980s, 1990s, we all know it was the globalization of businesses throughout the world really changed the way we did things. It made business completely different from it was before, whether we can cross borders in trade and finance. So globalization of business really changed the things that we did. But it also changed the way criminals acted because they globalized as well. Before that, it was very much about, well, they had their patch wherever they lived and they didn't spread very far out and there was a lot of turf wars, etc. But all of that was blown apart with globalization of crime, which was fed by the globalization of just business in the world. Many criminals got quite rich because of this, because again, the same way as globalization of business helped grow businesses and create greater level of wealth. So during those periods, in the 80s and the 90s, we had an explosion of crime. And I think those of us who can remember that will know that it's, well, quite frankly, it's still going on. But now I want to talk to you about the global response to this predicament that we're in the 1980s, 1990s. Now, the first real change, because whilst it was law, people didn't take a lot of notice about it. But 9/11 changed everything. 9/11, of course, is an iconic event where one of those things that you can always know where you were. I'm going to digress for 1 minute because I can remember, and I wish you could have seen me. I was sleeping on a cot in Newfoundland in a convention center because I was flying from London to Miami on that day, and we were forced to land in Newfoundland because the flight couldn't get into US airspace. I will never forget that time, but it was a period when our lives changed, and a lot of things had happened because of 9/11. And as I say, in the anti-money laundering and financing of terrorism world, things changed. The concept of follow the money, which I'll talk about a bit more as we go along, became a bit more to the top of the table, really, because the big question was at that time, how did these terrorists manage to finance to do that sort of damage that they did? As it was, with regards to 9/11, it was determined that there wasn't much funding required to do the damage that they did because they didn't cost them it was an air ticket, it was perhaps a hotel the night before, very, very normal things. But it opened up the thinking about, let's follow the money, and that might find our way to the criminals and what are they doing. The other thing, of course, is airport security. We never imagined pre 9/11 how we would have to go through security, and we take that for granted. But even then, this massive change in 9/11 and the way that law enforcement look at acts like that and looks at criminals that have exploded in terms of the globalization, still everybody would say it's not in my backyard. It might be happening, but it doesn't happen where I am. So I'm watching from the side. So as time went on after 9/11, they began law enforcement began to realize that there was a real link between organized crime and the cleaning, and I say cleaning of money, because that's what a criminal has to do. He has the collection of proceeds of his crime, but it's referred to as being dirty. It's referred to as, well, how do you explain that sort of accumulation of wealth if you're not going to work every day, if you're not doing a lot of things that like normal people do? So at that stage, there was the organization of OECD, which was the head organization with a subgroup called the Financial Action Task Force. They changed and they provided recommendations to all the countries in the world, 180 plus countries in the world, to build on their 40 recommendations, as they refer to it, is one of which was to criminalize throughout the world that money laundering was a crime. The objective of that is that crime is no longer it pays. That's the idea, that they'd realize if we can stop the criminal having the fruits of his labors, enjoying it, then they may well not be wanting to do it. Criminals would be very patient. Nothing wrong in going to jail for 10 years or so if you're going to come out to a lifestyle with a big house and lots of money that you can just capture again. That was a cost of doing their business, really. It was, okay, I'm in jail, but when I'm out, my life will go on just as it is and just how I've accumulated all my good trappings of a good quality life. So that whole concept started everybody thinking, and it brought in, and this was with the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, that the financial sector would be asked to report what they regarded as being suspicious activity. In other words, here you've got a client, a customer, whose bank account, there's a lot going on in here, and yet he earns, $100,000 a year, but there's a huge amount of activity in his bank account. And they were required, and the recommendations encouraged countries to also make that into law. So it had to be reported and disclosed to the authorities that this bank account, this activity was looking suspect. That was one of the most important things that helped the thinking along the follow the money idea. Now, where we are now, 21 years on, people still say, not in my backyard. yes, we comply with airport security. We don't have a choice. We either do what we have to do, or we don't get on the flight. We get a feeling, because I'm sure many of us will have experienced the bank calling them and saying, okay, what's this money that's come into your account? What's happening? This is unusual. It's a huge amount of money, and you have to give an explanation. Now, the bank may well say, well, is there any evidence of that? And of course, if you've inherited money or you've sold your business, that doesn't happen without legal involvement, accountant involvement, or something. There's always going to be a record. But we will experience that, and we get to know that, and we've all had that sort of question put to us from time to time. Not many times, but the criminal, you can imagine, can't give a very good story. He has no records about the crimes, the drug trafficking they're doing, the corruption he's doing. He's not going to hand over records. So the criminal becomes very, very vulnerable when he touches the financial sector. Now, financial sector, this is the response that went further on, was to say, right, okay, yes, we're now asking the banks to look and scrutinize and look for activity that might look a bit suspicious or unusual. But then we started, again, because of the standard setters recommendations, they expanded the report of what we call reportable entities. In other words, those financial businesses outside of the banking to have to report suspicious activity. And this is where, because the standard setters operate just on recommendations to governments, they are encouraged to put things in place, and they are encouraged to make into law that lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, company formation agents, money service businesses, like Western Union, are obliged to also to report and disclose what might appear to be unusual activity. So there was this explosion because the criminal is very, very vulnerable. He has to tell a story, and he has to convince people that the money he's got is going to be legitimate money, and he can go ahead and buy that big house on the beach or whatever in my jurisdiction. That is not an uncommon situation. That's what a criminal wants to do, because that's what we all want to do if we get a certain amount of wealth. We want a second home. We want all that. So there was the global response was to tighten that up, to have legislation, but all countries are doing it different. They're at different levels because it's recommendations. I can say that for the US perspective, some things they've moved along very well, but other things it's still moving slowly. I could mention one thing about the US just now, that the legislation that's just recently been passed with this new administration included a Corporate Transparency Act. It's referred to as the Corporate Transparency Act of 2021. Legislation just passed. The devil is in the detail, as always, but so there's no regulations. But if you form a company now, you are required to disclose the name, address, and the details of all the shareholders, the owners, and such like. They have to report to one of the authorities in the US. They are catching up on some areas in Europe, and I would say in the Caribbean, where we've been getting that sort of information for many years. The concept about this giving information of a company, and I'm sure many of you will know that the idea of a company is that you have reduced liability, personal liability. The idea is you on a public register, you would have your name, but that's all. Now, one of the big hot topics in money laundering now is the use of the word anonymous companies and the use of the words beneficial ownership. That's where you can have a company be the legal owner on the register. You give the legal owner to somebody else, to a front man, and you're sitting at the top. It's your money, it's your investment, but you are not on any registers whatsoever. Now, this is very, very important to the United States, because when law enforcement are investigating acts that they think there is money laundering. Because the US dollar is the most traded currency in the world, the US get the most inquiries from any country in the world to say, here's a company, who are the people behind it? Now, obviously, from the criminal's perspective, this is perfect. There's no record. The criminal wants to have control over his money, but he doesn't want anybody to know that he has it. Let me give you an example of the use of companies. Isabel dos Santos is the daughter of the former president of the country Angola in Africa, a very, very poor country. Well, it's so poor that 55% of the people do not have running water. 55% of the people live on less than $1 a day. But Angola is a very rich country in both oil and diamonds, ripe for corruption. Isabel dos Santos, in her position, relationship obviously with her father, amassed a personal wealth of $2.5 billion. This is under investigation at the moment, but I'm telling you, it's in the press. You can read it. Old-fashioned term in the press. It's on the internet, isn't it? $2.5 billion. She formed 400 companies in 41 different countries throughout the world. That's how she hid her money. And it's only when they pull it all apart and they find. And I would say there will be some of the companies will be formed in the United States because there's very, very little information about the owners. In fact, some people would know, you may well know that the likes of Delaware and Wyoming, Nevada, you can form a company and you have to give very, very little information so that you've got complete anonymity. I want to just tell you, Global Financial Integrity, which is another advocate group, did a survey about 2 years ago about how much more information you have to give to get a library ticket than you have to when you form a company in the United States. And about 40-something states out of the 50, you have to give more information over to the library before you can get a library ticket than to form a company. That's just, that's just the evolution of the fight using money laundering. So, not in my backyard. That's why I want to say that you're probably saying this now. I've talked about this. I've talked about the Angola. I've talked about forming companies, and you say, well, everything's legitimate. That's fine. And I'm sure you're still skeptical. But I want to talk to you a couple of rhetorical questions. Have any of you, a family member or a good friend or whoever, has been associated with a drug overdose? Have any of you got a daughter or a niece who's hanging around with the wrong sort of person, doesn't seem to be doing the right things? You don't like a boyfriend, she's an early teenager and such like. Those two people, those two characteristics are likely to be victims of significant crimes like drug trafficking, and in the second case, with the grooming of a young girl with human trafficking. Human trafficking, and I want to talk to you a little bit about this now, because we can now get into the area of saying, look, this is not too far away from home. This is in your backyard. Human trafficking is a $150 billion industry in the world. $150 billion are generated by people that are human trafficked throughout the world in any one year. There is an advocacy group called Polaris who've named 25 different types of business that are rife for human trafficking. Now, I'm going to ask you another question. Do you use nail salons? Do you use car washes? Do you use landscaping companies? Do you employ domestic help through an agency? Do you use casual construction labor? Because they're the examples of the 25 that it's very likely, but not definitely, very likely that the people there will have been trafficked into this. Now, I want to make it clear as well that the people who are trafficked into that sort of thing may well not be illegal immigrants. They can come in on visas they can be convinced they come from Asia, wherever, Latin America. Yes, you could be a nanny you can do this, you can do that. And as soon as they come here, the passport is confiscated, the passport is taken off them. They never see that again. And they're forced into what we call forced labor. And they work horrendous hours, and they also have to live in deplorable conditions. They are trapped. They are victims. It is not their fault, but they are victims. Now, this is a horrendous crime with a huge amount of money. And this is where I say to you, this is closer than you think, because it is in your backyard. It's happening, and you're probably seeing it. The trouble is, we're all in the same place, that we don't know what we're looking for. You can't tell. They're not gonna, very few victims manage to come forward. And this is the point about Polaris, and I can leave the details in of their website, but it's a fascinating situation to read about. They also have a helpline that you can call, because if you feel that somebody is a victim, their main role is to help the victims to escape, and legitimately. But it is very, very different. There's many signs about human trafficked people. They're always reluctant, because if they're not going to be punished in this country, they're going to be punished. Their family's going to be punished in their own country. So, and this is slavery, modern slavery, and we think that slavery was stamped out legally many years ago. There are more people living in modern slavery now than there ever were slaves in when it was common. It's closer to than what you think. And I say to you, look at your family circle, and it's always going to be there. I've got to this stage. I'm happy to answer some questions before I finish off. I've just got a couple of more points, and being a banker, I've got one or two more statistics, but I thought it might be helpful. Any questions now? And I'm sure that Mr. Craig Adams will give me a heads up when he wants me to stop. But I'll wind up when we've had some questions, if that's in order, Craig.
Oh, absolutely, Paul. Yeah, it's been a fascinating presentation. So let's go ahead, and if you'd like, we can. Did you want to finish a few points and then we go into question and answer at that point, or would you rather us?
No, okay, I'll do that. I mean, it just rounded off. I more or less said it. Don't believe that it's not in your backyard, because it's everywhere and it's big. The other point is, I've got to this far, again, a statistic, human trafficking has generated $17 million. They've earned somebody or some group of people in the last 30 minutes. $17 million has been earned through the crime of human trafficking. And that gives us an idea of the scale. We can talk about billions in any one year, but when we get down to 30 minutes worth of income, that really makes us stand up and take notice. Thanks, Craig. I will happily answer questions.
All right, thanks, Paul. I have a quick question for you. You had mentioned Angola and the family being corrupt. I mean, is there anything that can be done to bring the family to justice if they're that corrupt?
There is, and it does happen. Because they spread themselves so far. I mean, they can't just keep their wealth within Angola, as the example. So they have their assets all around, and there's a huge amount of sort of cooperation between the various law enforcement areas. If they have, because they're moving money around, and they're found, and this is why we get the charge of money laundering. The crime of corruption probably took place in Angola, but the crime of money laundering takes place because if it flies through a bank in the US, and it's almost certainly going to be through the US because it will be in dollars, it will be a property that's been purchased, perhaps, on the west coast of the US, or however it happens, that could be confiscated. That's where, in the early days, that was the idea of taking the money out of crime. It's that it will confiscate asset. So they can be, but it's incredibly complex. And if you think of the 400, on Isabel dos Santos, that there's over 400 companies. To trace that and to build this spider's web of what she's done takes a long time. Money can go instantaneously across the world, but it takes weeks and months and years to trace it back to that one person.
Wow. I believe Bill Buchanan has a question, and then also Joel.
Good morning, Paul. Bill Buchanan.
Morning.
I have a friend who's one of our backcountry skiers, and he's retired from the Internal Revenue Service. And what he did after he retired was he set up a company that consults with banks on such subjects as money laundering. Is that your business model? Are your clients banks who are trying to comply with the local statutes on money laundering?
Yeah, I spent actually one of the reason why I have not been involved in banks, and to as much as I have been involved in Turks and Caicos with other areas of like lawyers and company formation, but there's no reason why I can't. I mean, as a regulator, I used to examine banks for money laundering compliance. The issue with a bank is that they're very hierarchical. So that you get a bank and they'll have, this huge compliance area where they write their own procedures, et cetera, et cetera. The reality is, and you find this in when we read about it on the internet, many banks, not only in the US, in the UK, in Europe, are being fined for inadequate anti-money laundering controls. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit like this argument at the time of the financial crisis. Too big to fail. The banks are too big to be penalized. HSBC was fined $8.2 billion about 15 years ago because they were operated on the Mexican border and a huge amount of money was laundered. So yes, that is exactly my role, is to say, well, what are the controls? What's the philosophy? Why are we missing this? Mm-hmm. And it's usually because there's a huge amount of activity going on and not sufficient people to investigate.
Thank you.
Joel Panzer.
Yes, thank you very, very much. Very interesting. Are you familiar with a movie called Laundromat?
That's what Panama Papers?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then my actual question was, do you see any inevitability or research being done into our past president? There's a lot of banks, Deutsche Bank and everything else going on. And now the research and the indictments are going to start to come down.
Well, and this is the point that I think I would say, I think there's every likelihood. I think because it's already been talked about that that Deutsche Bank have been sort of generally figuring in the press about, assisting Donald Trump in terms of money laundering. It's interesting that we've got this, there's a corruption, that's the crime. Money laundering is the means by which it's easier to prosecute somebody. So I think there's a likelihood. I think there certainly is. I have no view really on politically how far it would go, but there's absolutely no reason. I mean, let me tell you this is slightly different, but the premier of Turks and Caicos, there has been a case going on where there was massive corruption with the premier who siphoned a lot of the money, government money out of Turks and Caicos. And he is being prosecuted for corruption and money laundering. And that the money laundering is the most one that's likely to be caught. So it's quite frankly, the decision whether he's investigated is a decision. Well, I don't think anybody's sure what's going to happen, but yeah, there is certainly some smoke there by all accounts, if you believe what you read. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Antonio White.
Thank you, Paul, for a great presentation. My question is regarding Bitcoin and other types of currency, electronic currency, digital currency. And it seems as though I can acquire a whole lot of Bitcoin and simply give somebody my password, and that person can be making transactions with Bitcoin that I accumulated. And that would seemingly be a very easy way to launder a whole lot of money. And with the $800 billion market cap plus of Bitcoin today, what are your thoughts about dealing with digital currencies such as that as being able to be traceable?
My view on this, the policymakers are really still getting to grips with this whole concept. I mean, at the moment, it's seen as, you mentioned a fairly large amount, but when you think of the size of international trade and international transactions, it's not huge. But there is definitely evidence, particularly in the financing of terrorism, that the terrorism organizations, as opposed to a terrorist, but the terrorist organizations are moving value around using currencies like Bitcoin. The interesting thing about Bitcoin is it's a bit like saying, well, we could move money around in euros. Sooner or later it needs to come back to the currency that you need to do. You can't buy a property, with Bitcoin. I mean, one or two the I've read recently that they'll say yes, you can pay in cryptocurrency, but all they do is they point you to an exchange, and then you have got to go to the exchange and buy that in the same way as you would go to buy euro or sterling, and then pay for it. So it's a bit of the jury is still out exactly where it is and how to do it. The specialists will tell you that there is an audit trail. You can follow who made the transaction. Beyond that, I'm not, I can't give a view beyond that level of detail, but it's very early days, but it's definitely on the radar.
Understood. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks. Great question. Who else has a question? Betty?
Hello, Betty.
Hi, thank you for an excellent presentation. A couple things. You're right about well, of course you're right about the Bitcoin. I do know that there's been a couple, one of my clients wanted to use Bitcoin and I basically stayed out of it. It was just too over my head. I had the lender deal with him, but you're right. He had to convert it and so forth. So my question is the Polaris. I don't know if they're dealing in California, but a colleague of mine is dealing with helping with human trafficking in the East Bay, because there's a tremendous amount going on, as you said, everywhere. So it really is in our backyard. The other thing, what can you do? I thought how noble of her to help out. I would be afraid to get involved, because what if the people who are doing the human trafficking go after the people who are trying to help? Isn't that's a very selfish thought. What would you say?
Yeah, well, my understanding, and the US is ahead of many countries as far as I can see. But this helpline, whether it's a 1-888 number that you can call and you can talk to them, and all that has been thought through. But I do understand the dilemma that you would say, well, look, I just don't want to. It's a question of at what stage does your emotion take over from something else? Because I mean, the people who are trafficked are beaten. They're not fed properly. I mean, it's just horrendous. The thought of it, that somebody is there and they're forced into labor against their will, because that's the definition of trafficked people. And so, I would say that's it. But I mean, certainly there is not, you make a call to the helpline that they have, and that's Polaris have one. They will not be coming round and knocking on your door the next day and say, tell us all about it. They really, the reality is that one individual, which is very sad, but they're really looking for the, who sits on the top? What organization? When I talk about organized crime, what organized crime part is dealing with this? And it's definitely large when you can make that sort of money. 150 billion a year, not one organization, but you can see it's very lucrative.
And you can also,
but definitely, they don't go knock on the door and say, well, tell us about it.
But you can help, and you can help by contributing. And then I was
Right.
going to ask you about confiscating of the properties that these criminals have accumulated. That's a big, where the government takes over the properties, correct? Takes them back.
Yeah, but only with the sanction of the courts.
Yeah.
I mean, it has to be proven in illegally. That's what's happened.
Yeah.
But we come back to the involvement of the use by money laundering is you can't explain that asset. And so then through the courts, the court can say, well, we confiscate that. You know, it's the idea. And there is what, certainly in this country, and it will be in other countries, then there's a forfeiture fund, national forfeiture fund we have in Turks and Caicos. That money is reinvested into crime prevention. So, you know, the criminal is taking, you know, that $5 million house is confiscated, sold, and the money goes to continue with crime prevention. But it goes through the court. I mean, it's not just, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I know.
You take it off.
So Paul, I'm looking at the clock. It's 8:45. How are you on time? Can you take a few more questions?
I'm fine. I can keep that. You could keep me going forever, but
Okay.
I'm fine.
Thank you. I know Patricia has a question. Patricia?
Well,
Patricia.
one, I would like it acknowledged that I was in, I believe it was Derek Arden's, and I saw you in and he introduced you and I said, oh, would you speak for the Breakfast Club? So I
Thank you.
discovered him, and that was absolutely fabulous. What I believe our friends would be interested in, probably about 10 years ago, I was delivering a presentation for district attorneys in California. And I was saying a great way to open a presentation is an interesting statistic or little known fact, and which you had some fabulous statistics. And I said, add an emotion. And one gentleman got up and said, would it shock you to know that San Mateo County is the third largest area in the country for modern day slavery? So it is close to home. Now, it might have been California. I remember it, you know,
Right,
the country.
right,
It was probably
right.
California, but it is close to home. So I agree with Betty. This is terrifying.
Well,
Paul,
Patricia, sorry, can I'll interrupt and
Yeah.
say thank you very much for that tip. The tip that I picked up from you in one of your sessions was about starting with something that's you know, that catches everybody's eye, and that would surprise you is another thing, because it would surprise people to know that human trafficking takes place in the country with Americans. It's about 400,000 Americans who are trafficked in any 1 year, living in America. Just, you know, if I use the word indigenous people, you know, citizens of the United States. It's just amazing. And we don't think that. It's Asia. It's Latin America. We don't think it's on our doorstep.
No, Paul, I noticed you had a great grabber before. That was wonderful. You got my thumbs up. And Nevada, where I also have a home, have a big commission on modern day slavery and human trafficking. And one of the laws that they passed that is very obvious, on the back of all the doors of the stalls in the Las Vegas airport have, you know, if you're being trafficked, need help, in multiple languages with an 800 number to call.
Wow.
Right, that's interesting.
But great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Patricia. We have time for one more question. Susan Rowan.
You know, Marin, I think it's all over. My neighbor's church had been working to support a young woman who cleverly started a big to-do at the airport. The TSA agent called her superior, and the superior said, something's different about this girl. She's not just acting out, but realized she might have been trafficked, and with that saved her. I grew up in organized crime, Chicago, so it's very dear to my heart. But when I moved to San Francisco, people said it's not like that here. Folks, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And right now, I'm ear reading Flash Boys about the complicity of the banks and the hedge funds. And I also did that with Blowout, with our gas and oil money, where I learned about, and I don't know if you heard this, about, I think it's called Ghanaian, or the son of the head of Ghana. The oil money did not go to the people but this guy had like 12 houses and excesses and somehow hasn't been caught or stopped. How do we get to those people?
Well, the fact it's in the public domain, I guess, means that that they're on that journey. The corruption is enormous, and the fact that there's a lot of the African countries are rich in natural resources, and the people are very poor. And I saw that this morning. I read somewhere that Nigeria were about 18 billion per annum moves out through illicit acts of criminals out of Nigeria through corruption. And you think to a place like Nigeria, where you think anywhere, any country in the world could do with 18 billion, couldn't they? You know, it's just unbelievable that that happens. But yes, it has happened. One of the things I was going to say at the very end, this sort of phenomena that when you hear about something, then you start to read about it. For the next few days, you'll see money laundering, you'll see organized crime, and you will begin to see, when you looking on Twitter or whatever, how much of it is happening.
Thank you. I took 4 pages of notes.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah,
Well,
thanks, Susan.
I'm honored. Thank you.
I took a couple pages also. I mean, it's a fascinating subject, but it does hit close to home, and it just, what can we do about it? It's almost like it seems like the government should be on top of this more than they are.
Yeah, the government's the Financial Action Task Force has a review process, and countries it's public reports produced, and the USA had one produced, and they were criticized in certain areas and complimented in certain areas. The UK had exactly the same. We had in Turks and Caicos, we had one a couple of years ago. It's not perfect. It started off with get the laws in place, and now they say, well, how good are you at implementing those laws? And the FATF, as they refer to it, is the watchdog, and they publicly shame countries for not doing the right things.
Wow. Well, Paul, thank you so much for your message today. I'm looking at the clock, so we're going to go ahead and just thank you at the moment for your presentation. Really appreciate you sharing with us today at the Breakfast Club. With that,
I'm sure if anybody has any more questions, sorry, Craig, if anybody has any more questions, any thoughts or whatever, I'm sure, I'm not asking people to write down my email now, but through yourself, you could, please contact me. I could talk on this for a long time.
Well, we're going to go ahead and we're going to close stop the recording here in a moment, but we'll keep the room open for a little bit longer if you have any further questions for Paul or would like to visit. And again, thank you for joining us this week at the Golden Gate Breakfast Club. And thank you again, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you for the invite.